He was already a man when he had his first glimpse of the sea, on the first night of a voyage from Spain to Italy, when he left the harsh countryside around Toledo for the papal city of Rome. That first night on the sea introduced him into an unknown world. Suspended between earth and heaven, he found himself alone amidst the vastness of nature. Able for the first time to contemplate its movements, they struck him as the embodiment of purity, that same purity he sought in music, his own art. In the night darkness, in the open sea, his ears straining skywards, he was one day to sense the music of the spheres, that sweet symphony, produced by stars and planets as they rise majestically into view, caressing each other in their courses. The years that Diego Ortiz spent in Rome were those of his greatest fame. His reputation as a virtuoso had spread beyond the city walls. His books on how to play the viola da gamba were highly regarded in Venice and beyond the Alps. One spring day in 1552, he received a package bearing the royal seal. It had been sent to him by the King of Spain in person, Charles V. It contained a book and a letter. The title page of the book bore the words Nicolae Copernici Torinensis, de revolutionibus orbium caelestium, and the letter contained a request that he go to Naples to revitalize the choir and orchestra of the Chapel Royal. Copernicus's book was to revolutionize thousands of years of thinking concerning the life of the universe, and the king's letter was to do the same for the life of Diego Ortiz, which had lasted just 30. During his time in Naples, the Magister Musices had found only one place which could rekindle the emotions of that first night at sea: the tip of the Castel dell'Ovo. There, he felt that he was on the open sea again, and after Vespers he would go there at night when there was a new moon. With his own hands he had built himself a long bench where he could sit and contemplate the moon and listen to the sound of the sea. By performing that small, unchanging rite, he could remove himself from the dangers of public life and turn his ears trustingly towards the heavens. He would remain in this rapt state of contemplation for hours, until he could hear the perfect harmony of that immensity ringing powerfully within him. Only then would he get up and go to the little chapel in the castle where he kept one of his instruments. In that same mood, he would sing and play until he was exhausted, as though he hoped to transform that grace with which he had been filled into some form of earthly music. That was his way of offering his prayers to God. On a moonless night 15 years later in 1567, he was presented with a surprise. A man, his eyes set firmly on the heavens, was stretched out on his bench. Ortiz drew his sword. The glint of metal suddenly cleaved the darkness, and the unknown figure stood up sharply, alarmed. He claimed to be a young Neapolitan who simply enjoyed looking at the stars and who had swum up to the tip of the Castel dell'Ovo for this purpose. The young man begged for mercy and identified Jupiter, resplendent low on the horizon to the south, and these few words were enough to cause Ortiz to put down his sword, all suspicion being thus dispelled. After the publication of his Musices Liber Primus, Ortiz was convinced that he was in constant danger, because in it he had made fun of and offended Neapolitan musicians. But he felt no fear on meeting the young man who loved the stars, and he talked with him of astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. Before the sun rose, they had talked of the music of the spheres, and the young man had said that if Plato and Dante had ever heard Camilla Esposito singing, they would have pronounced her voice the loveliest music in the universe. Intrigued, Ortiz asked if he could hear her singing. The young Neapolitan explained that Camilla Esposito would be singing in the Church of the Annunziata at Sunday Vespers. The Annunziata was the preserve of Domenico da Nola, the Neapolitan musician who transformed abandoned waifs into singers and instrumentalists. There was talk of events in which hundreds of performers took part, inducing a state of beatitude in even the most stricken souls. Music cannot work miracles, thought Ortiz to himself. Though he had been living in Naples for many years, he had never allowed himself to hear the music of the Neapolitan chapels, which he regarded with disdain. Intra angustos terminos esse positam, ut a suis progenitoribus nulla similitudine sit agnoscenda. The music was so badly treated that even its own forefathers would not recognize it. Nonetheless, to somehow creep up on them and hear a snatch of it remained his heart's desire. The boy offered to go with him to the Annunziata to hear Vespers the following Sunday, and the Magister took him up on the offer. He would go in disguise, unarmed and without an armed escort. Tufts of his curly beard could just be glimpsed under the hooded friar's cloak as his servants watched him slipping off on foot to be swallowed up into the teeming, narrow, dark and noisy little alleyways. As arranged, the star-gazing young man was waiting for him outside the church. The sun was just setting as they went in. The church was packed. The celebrant intoned the Deus in Adjutorium, to which the monks responded from the apse. From the sweetness of those voices, he suddenly realized he was about to be immersed in a world of sound utterly different from anything he had experienced before, and he felt a sudden pang of fear. Then the psalms were delivered, in the raw, passionate voices of the people, by monks standing around the lectern. When they began to sing the Gloria, the monks raised their arms to the heavens, and Ortiz found himself following their gaze and joining their pleas for the mercy of God. The Magister had never known anything like it. A tornado of music, stunning and intoxicating, great gusts of sound like wind blew on his face. It was after the Confiteor, sung in parallel fifths, that the miracle occurred. The polyphony being rendered in a way he could never have imagined. A few voices, singing a cappella, seemed to be issuing from all parts of the church at the same time. But when he peered around to see where they were coming from, there were no singers to be seen. The melody of the Alma Redemptoris Mater, sung by a sole soprano voice, rang out clearly above the other parts. The young Neapolitan nudged the Magister. This was the voice of Camilla Esposito. Her pitch was perfect, and the timbre of her voice was beyond the extraordinary. When she sang high notes, it sweetened in colour and shone like silver. And when she went lower in the register, it darkened to the hue of bronze. He could not make out where it was coming from. It was as though the roof had been torn open and it was descending straight from the heavens themselves. During the long notes of the canto fermo, the singer executed a sustained trill, as though she wanted to execute a form of aerial drawing. Such was the music the Magister had publicly deplored, but now that he was immersed in it, he had but one single thought: to know what his own music would sound like if it were sung like this. This desire was short-lived. Just as the choir was launching loudly into the motet, he felt the hood of his habit being thrust against his face. Then he was dragged backwards, though the all-enveloping mass of sound made any attempt to call for help quite useless. They carried him away, through streets crawling with people, to what he was convinced would be his doom. The young man who loved stars. He found himself in a large empty room, alone. Hours later, 6 men veiled in white came in, and, together with them, the notes of a villanella sung by a voice that was unmistakable. Camilla Esposito was there too. The reason he had been sentenced to death was now explained to him. A young Neapolitan girl had been seized by a group of Spanish soldiers and violated in the cartiere. One of her assailants had been himself. 1,000 words would not suffice to expunge such infamy. The singing came closer. Now the singer was just outside the door, and now Camilla Esposito's face itself appeared. The beauty of her features could not disguise the rage and scorn with which she uttered the words empio cor, cruda voglia. As he came closer, he could feel her warm breath upon his face. Now, a descending second sung from the chest seemed to target the Magister's very heart, as though at that moment music had the power to kill. And she disappeared. Diego Ortiz was imprisoned in the premises of the Propaganda Center for the Refinement of Musical Taste, a place where music was a welcome guest. And for this reason, he was allowed to use an instrument to accompany his prayers. He was brought a viola da gamba, which he tuned with great care and then began to play. It was the music that saved him. He sang and played the whole night through, as he had done in the little chapel at the Castel dell'Ovo. He accompanied himself singing the Salve Regina, the Alma Redemptoris, and other motets all through the night. The palace resounded till dawn with his counterpoint, and all the musicians present stayed awake to listen to the marvels of his art. Camilla Esposito, on the other hand, slept the sleep of the just, and it was she who, the following morning, requested his release. In her sleep, lulled by his music, the face of a woman had appeared to her, a woman who was holding half a Neapolitan medal in her hand. She herself, Camilla Esposito, had had the other half tied to her right wrist, ever since her mother had abandoned her at the door of the Annunziata, wrapped in a scrap of green cloth. Finding that half medal had been Camilla's daily dream. Ortiz's nocturnal music had given her a ray of hope. For her, it was a sign that was heaven sent. The Magister was bought fresh clothing, and there was no need for words. Everyone paid homage to him and his music, and had him taken to the Palazzo Reale, certain that one of these days he would be back to have them arrested in their turn. He did indeed return, but with a gift and a request. The gift was the Musices Liber Primus, and the request that they all foregather in the Chapel Royal prior to singing and playing at the solemn Vespers of the Certosa of San Martino in the presence of the Viceroy of Spain. The event occurred on the 11th of November, 1567. The performance began when one of the Carthusian monks struck a sharp blow upon one of the petals of the black stone flower in the chapel of St. John the Baptist, the cue for Camilla Esposito to sing the Dixit Dominus. Then everyone began to sing and play. Rodio, Danola, Valente, Dentice, and the Magister himself gathered around the large wooden lectern of San Martino. For the first time, Naples and Spain were raising their voices together in a single song. That was Camilla Esposito's greatest miracle. But another, more personal one was about to occur. At the word mater of the Benedicta es Celorum, the Neapolitan girl heard the half metal she wore attached to her wrist roll down to the floor, bounce twice, pause a moment at the feet of a nun kneeling in prayer behind the altar, and then move on to come to rest upon some marble grating. Camilla stopped singing and ran to pick it up. But at the same moment the nun ceased praying and put out one of her warm white hands to reach towards the floor. Their fingers touched. The girl raised her eyes and found that she was looking into the face of the woman who had appeared to her in her dream. As on that now distant night, now too the music of Diego Ortiz was resonating in the air around her. Nobody ever knew why Camilla Esposito had suddenly stopped singing that night. Not even the Magister. Now that the Vespers were over, he was listening entranced to the perfect harmonies which concluded his own Salve Regina for 5 voices. A resplendent Venus was shining high in the sky. The moon was high above the horizon to the south. Orion and Sirius would briefly be masters of the night. But what was gradually fading away before his very eyes was nothing less than the music of the spheres.